Today, bread is one of the most ordinary foods on earth. We eat it without thinking about where it came from. But what if I told you that people were making bread thousands of years before humans became farmers? Around 14,000 years ago, there were no modern farms, no wheat fields stretching across the horizon, and no villages filled with granaries. Most people in this part of the world still lived by hunting, gathering, and following seasonal resources. In the landscapes of Southwest Asia, wild grasses grew naturally. Their seeds were small, but they were packed with energy. For hunter-gatherers, these tiny grains could become an important source of food. People began collecting these wild plants more deliberately. They did not yet have domesticated wheat fields. Instead, they searched the landscape for useful plants, carried them back to their camps, and experimented with ways to make them easier to eat. Thousands of years later, archaeologists discovered an extraordinary place in northeastern Jordan. It is called Shubayqa 1, located in an area known as the Black Desert. Inside an ancient structure, archaeologists found fireplaces, and hidden among the remains of those fires were tiny pieces of something unexpected, charred food that looked like ancient bread. The remains were incredibly small, but scientists examined their microscopic structure and plant particles. The evidence showed that these fragments were not simply burned seeds. They had been processed into a bread-like food. The astonishing part was their age. The evidence dates to roughly 14,400 years ago. That means people were making bread long before agriculture became established. This completely changes the simple story we often imagine. We usually picture humans inventing farming, growing wheat, and then inventing bread. But the archaeological evidence suggests something much more complicated. The people at Shubayqa 1 were Natufian hunter-gatherers. They lived in communities and used a wide variety of plants and animals. They were not farmers in the later Neolithic sense. Imagine them walking through the dry landscape, searching for wild grasses. They gathered grains that were naturally growing around them and brought them back to their settlement. But raw grains are difficult to eat, so the grains had to be processed. They were dehusked and ground, probably using stone tools, turning hard seeds into something closer to flour. Scientists found evidence for wild einkorn and other plant ingredients. Some of the ancient food also contained evidence consistent with root foods, including clubrush tubers. These ingredients could be processed together with water to create a primitive dough or mixture. It would have been very different from the soft bread we know today. Then came the most important step: heat. The ancient inhabitants baked or cooked their mixture near a fireplace. Something simple was transformed into a portable, edible food. It may not have looked like a modern loaf. The researchers described the remains as bread-like products, probably flat and unleavened. But the basic idea was already there. Why would hunter-gatherers spend so much effort making bread? Scientists cannot know the exact answer. It may have been practical food, nutritional food, portable food, or even something prepared for special gatherings. Making this food was not easy. Someone had to collect the plants, remove unwanted parts, grind the grains, prepare the mixture, and cook it. For people living without modern tools, that was serious work. But the effort had an advantage. Once cooked and dried, bread-like food could be easier to carry and store than many fresh foods. For mobile communities, that could have been extremely useful. And here is where the story becomes truly surprising. Bread was not necessarily the reward of farming. Instead, people may have already valued bread-like foods before they began depending heavily on agriculture. Over the following thousands of years, people increasingly exploited wild cereals. Their relationship with plants became deeper, and eventually some wild species began changing under human selection. Plants that were once gathered from the landscape gradually became crops. Humans began planting, tending, harvesting, and selecting the seeds they preferred. By around 9,000 years ago, domesticated cereal economies had become widespread in Southwest Asia. Farming was no longer a small experiment. It was becoming a major way of life. As people invested more heavily in crops, settlements could become more permanent. Storage, tools, houses, food preparation, and agriculture became increasingly connected. Around this broader period of transition, remarkable communities were building enormous monuments. At Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Anatolia, hunter-gatherers constructed monumental stone structures between roughly 9,600 and 8,200 BCE. The world was changing. People were no longer simply following food across the landscape. They were increasingly shaping the landscape around themselves. Eventually, bread moved from something that required special effort into a regular part of agricultural life. Domesticated cereals became dependable food resources, and bread became a staple. But those tiny blackened fragments at Shubayqa 1 preserve a remarkable clue. They show that the story of bread began before the story of farming was complete. Human history rarely happens in a straight line. People experiment first. They discover what works. They return to useful ideas. And over generations, those small choices can completely transform civilization. So the next time you eat a piece of bread, remember this. Its story may reach back more than 14,000 years, to a small fire in the ancient landscape of Jordan, where hunter-gatherers were already turning wild plants into something remarkably close to bread.